Let her conquer fear and fall like a sword. I run into the heat of day, like a knife I fight until the fight is won. In the rain I save each and every one till this war is won.
During the last years of the PlayStation, Naughty Dog had fulfilled its contract on the Crash Bandicoot series, concluding with Team Racing, which has currently been received as the 58th example of shit-headed microtransactions in 2018 or 2019, because Activision's all of its games. The Dude Bro boys, wising up with experience, had decided to move on from their first foray into console development to the Jak and Daxter series, a PS2 mascot pairing that had a similar level of personality to Crash, with the ability to storytell that the 6th gen had allowed the company to do. It was a smart move since it allowed the company to branch out and gain new expertise, broaden their portfolio, and heightened up the public perception of what they were capable of accomplishing, and most importantly, just being good content producers and making good money. The Dude Bros of the early days had gone on to grow up as successful artistic businessmen, but the question becomes, what actually happened to Crash in the meantime? Well, the odd thing was that unlike Fear, which failed mostly because none of its owners really knew what to do with it, Crash was put into the same situation when the PlayStation cycle ended, but Crash's new owners also wanted to invest time and money into it since Crash was such an iconic weirdo, which is why this franchise bounced around but also continued to produce games every year or so up until the PlayStation 3 era. This time around, Crash's patron is Traveller's Tales, a British developer that, like Willie Nelson, were quite good at collaborating and getting their name out through successful partnerships. Never quite branching out as an independent content maker, Traveller's Tales still produced quality work, with companies like Sega, Disney, and Psygnosis working on Sonic the Disney movie tie-ins, and finally coming into their own by forming into TT Games and developing the incredibly silly LEGO movie games with their newfound acquisition assets. So, the guys at this place had the efficiency, they had the work ethic, but did they have the creative minds to launch this thing into the new age of 3D graphics? Well, we'll get into that later. Let's talk about what the Wrath of Cortex actually is before we start. The game is obviously the first tentative steps of Crash's new handlers to work the franchise onto the PS2, which had the promise of powerful new hardware that could create virtual stories that we could have only dreamed of on the limited PlayStation hardware of the late 90s, and likewise, the game had some slight issues. The art style is a little off as the new 3D graphics proved to be a testing ground for what these characters' high-res models would eventually look like, which is most obvious when you look at Cortex in the opening cutscene, and yeah, the whole point of Cortex is that he's supposed to have a weird head and body shape, but I think TT was overdoing it a little bit. It might have been that Traveller's Tales was working too closely on translating the old PlayStation sprites to new hardware, rather than doing something better by totally redoing them and giving them a more modern look. Something to kind of establish them in this new generation of consoles rather than just making a high-res version of what was on the PlayStation. So, since we're here, let's get to the ever-important plot of these games that they never seem to adequately finish. The games are now being published directly by Universal, so the game is still retaining some of the Hollywood assets that really brought Crash's comedy styling into its own with its voice actors and its good writing. Looking over it again, Wrath of Cortex has a lot in common with the new Super Mario series, in that it's the classic formula of elaborate cutscene at the start, one at the end, and only the platforming gameplay in the middle, because having a plotline is for chumps. Wrath of Cortex does more to justify the lack of plot turns than Mario does, so at least we'll be having a little bit of a better time than those lazier games from the bargain bin of Nintendo. The plot line here is that Uka Uka is once again furious at Crash's Rogues Gallery for completely screwing up everything that they've tried in order to destroy Crash and take over the world. And in their latest meeting to figure out what the hell their next plan is going to be, Cortex lets slip that he's been working on a new weapon of mass destruction with a ton of his spare time in secret. But while he does have the weapon ready to go, he doesn't actually have a power source for it. Uka Uka is the magic master to counter Cortex's science nonsense, and so he helps the universe pull out of its ass the Elementals, a group of other magical masks hitherto unknown that suffered the same fate as Uka Uka, being imprisoned on Crash Island because they kept causing insanely powerful natural disasters in like 2 seconds flat. Uka Uka frees them immediately to power Cortex's super death machine. Obviously, Aku Aku notices this immediately, and because this is a Crash Bandicoot game, the Cataclysm can be solved simply by throwing enough power crystals at it, and in the effort of doing so, Coco presumably pulls from her ass a virtual teleporter thingamabob that helps Crash traverse the entire world, finding another set of crystals to plunder from various parts of the Earth. So at this point, if you're thinking it's another verse same as the first, then you are absolutely correct. Instead of coming at this newly accessed IP with a host of new ideas, Traveler's Tales seems to have been given the directive to just make another Crash game, and that's about it. Make it next gen, but make sure it looks like what the fans remember, and so we get a game that's basically Crash Bandicoot 3 again, with a 3D graphics overhaul for all of the levels and all of the characters. It's the same overall plot template, the same 5-level hubs, the same taunting from the bosses throughout the levels with the great stereotypical accents that bring some character to the fact that all the bosses are masks, and also Crunch Bandicoot, who is our classic evil twin villain. They did get someone even better to do his voice though than the Elementals. The voice acting for this game is still phenomenal for everyone, it's just that his was pulling a bit more of his own weight than the other guys. The actual levels the game has are pretty standard layout as well. A lot of the gimmicks are borrowed from Naughty Dog's days with the near total absence of chase levels. There are the levels that mix 2D and 3D platforming and are pure jumping challenges through and through. You get those vehicle section levels where you play a shoot 'em up for a couple minutes, or you get one race mission, which is usually a high point in the action, but then you do hit the levels that Traveler's Tales did put together themselves, the ball mazes. These things are very large and elaborate levels where you are given Crash in a hamster ball and have to use that to navigate him through a world of ramps, traps, and enemy weirdos. If you ever played Super Mario Galaxy 2, then you have seen basically this same thing as the Star Ball challenges, except there's a major difference is that the maps are much larger with wider rails to work with. Thankfully, the game checkpoints at a decent enough pace that it doesn't get overly annoying when you fail, but the mazes are tricky nonetheless, with traps that can catch you off guard and some finicky as hell turns that can easily send you flying into the abyss. What makes this worse is that the camera for these levels is more top-down, which doesn't give you a good sight of what's ahead of you, so honestly, the best thing you can do is take these levels at a snail's pace and just waddle around all the obstacles, since there really isn't a hard time limit to worry about when you're doing these. Sometimes these maze levels can be pretty enthralling, since you do eventually have the opportunity to hit high speeds and make sharp, cool-ass turns around corners, but these are few and far between due to how many hurdles are put in the way of you and having fun in these levels. But overall, the entire level pack of the game are pretty, they're usually fun to play through, full of that expected variety that the other Crash games have offered, and since they're still limited to doing only 25 of them, the condensed quality helps to have the overall game pop off the screen. The settings of the levels aren't as integral to the overall selling point as warps were, but they do put you in a bunch of different time periods nonetheless, so you get to still have that feeling of the journey to places all around the planet, along with the fun, challenging, platforming time that you remember from the original Crash trilogy. You'll definitely have a whole ball of a time with how many different levels you're given, the fact that you really don't know what's around the next corner until you get there, and there's just a whole bunch of different things to do, and the levels do feel unique, even though kinda like what Mario does. The game is fun, but the specific levels aren't exactly super memorable, but they are fun nonetheless, even though you aren't going to be remembering them. After everything's said and done, and most of the elementals are easily defeated in their own boss fights, the story ends with a slapstick stunt that should embarrass the entire Rogues Gallery altogether. Especially since none of them were really doing anything to help out their world domination plan, hinging entirely on Crash Bandicoot doing everything that he can with the elementals to do what they failed to do as a giant team. So after Cortex is defeated yet again, Uka Uka gets angry at him for yet another failure, and manages to shoot the self-destruct button on his new space station, which causes everything to be destroyed and the heroes to survive because of potato salad, and this denouement causes Crunch to be released from serving Cortex, and for some reason, he's immediately a part of the Bandicoot family and just lives with them now, which is a really odd turn of events, but it works out for better or worse in later games, so why the hell not? So yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a recommendation from this video, the best thing I could say is that if you liked Crash 3, then you will definitely like this, because it's basically the same game again running on better horsepower. Is what I always liked about this franchise was that Naughty Dog and Universal got some grade A talent to provide characterization and the character voices to their Rogues Gallery right at the start. And then throughout the entire run of the Crash franchise, they were able to continuously bring them back each and every time, and they're always good, and they usually have some good writers coming in throughout, which is why Universal's involvement was always a good thing, since they did bring in some movie-grade assets to this franchise that helped to differentiate Crash above its peers in its genre. So yeah, Wrath of Cortex is a good game and a good way to kill one of your days off from your job if you needed an idea to burn time. We'll finish off this week's video with the final scoreboard. And I'll wish you all out there a victory for gamers, as a thanks for watching the video. Have a nice night.